我错的引爆点。
I want to tell you a story about when I moved to New York City in 1993. I was 30 years old, and I was moving to what was known as one of the most dangerous big cities in the United States. And every night I would go up with my friends.
At the end of every night.
这个短语的意思是每个晚上都会发生某件事情。在这段字幕中，它被用来描述讲故事的人和他们朋友们每个周末晚上都会聚集在一起，讨论如何让大家安全地回家。
Friends on a Friday or Saturday night, and at the end of every night we would have a little conference and we would pool all of our money and we would figure out.
Pool all of our money.
这个词组的意思是将所有人的钱合并起来，用于共同的目的。在这段字幕中，它被用来描述讲故事的人和他们朋友们在每个周末晚上都会聚集在一起，讨论如何让大家安全地回家。
How everyone was going to get home, because you couldn't go home.
Figure out how everyone was going to get home.
这个短语的意思是讨论如何让所有人安全地回家。在这段字幕中，它被用来描述讲故事的人和他们朋友们每个周末晚上都会聚集在一起，讨论如何让大家安全地回家。
On the subway by yourself, and you could walk home, and if you were a woman, you definitely were not allowed to go home by yourself at 1 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday night. That's what it meant.
At 1 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday night.
这个短语描述了一个特定的时间点，表明是在周六晚上深夜的一刻钟。这句话体现了美国人对时间的具体描述。
To be in this very scary city called New York. I used to live.
Very scary city called New York.
这个短语表达了对纽约的恐惧感，这是因为它是一个大城市，可能会有很多犯罪和危险。这种说法体现了美国人对某些地方的负面看法。
In the 6th floor of a walk up in the West Village, and my bedroom faced the fire escape, and even in the summer I had no air conditioning. I had to keep my window closed because I was scared that somebody would come down the fire escape into my apartment. And then one day I woke up and I realized that I wasn't scared anymore, and I kept the window open. And I realized that when I was going out with my friends, we weren't having that conference at the end of the evening anymore. We were just going home. This city that I had thought, we all thought, was one of the scariest in the United States, wasn't scary anymore. And I remember at the time, I was absolutely transfixed by this transformation. I couldn't understand it. It was the same city full of the same weird, screwed up people, same buildings, same institutions, only nobody was murdering each other anymore. And I would call up criminologists and I would ask them, what's your explanation? And no one could give me a good explanation. And I remember one day, I used to go to the NYU, New York University has a library called Bobst Library. I used to go to Bobst to look for ideas. And I remember one day I was on the 6th floor in the sociology section, HM1A6. And I was reading back issues, yes I was, back issues of the American Journal of Sociology. And I ran across an article from 1991 by a guy named Jonathan Crane called The Epidemic Theory of Ghetto Life. And I'm going to read to you from how it began. The word epidemic is commonly used to describe the high incidence of social problems in ghettos. The news is
Epidemic of social problems.
这个知识点的含义是指某种社会问题突然爆发并迅速蔓延。惯用法是使用这个短语来描述某种社会问题的快速增长。
is filled with feature stories on crack epidemics, epidemics of gang violence, and epidemics of teenage childbearing. The term is used loosely in popular parlance, but turns out to be remarkably apt. And what Crane was saying is that if you look at these kinds of social problems, they behave, they come and they go, they rise and they fall exactly like viruses do. He was saying that that term epidemic is not a metaphor, it's a literal description. And I'll never forget when I read that little paragraph, and I was standing in this aisle in Bobst library, and you know, it's a library. It's got that hush and that musty smell of books, and I'm reading this crazy article from 1991, and I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, that's what happened in New York. We had an epidemic of crime. And what is the hallmark of an epidemic? It's the tipping point. It's the moment.
Tipping point.
这个知识点的含义是指某个事件或情况达到临界点，导致大规模变化。惯用法可以用于描述经济、社会等领域中的重大转变。
When the epidemic either goes up all at once or crashes all at once. And so I wrote an article for the New Yorker magazine called The Tipping Point, which was my attempt to use this theory to explain what happened in New York. And then I, because of that article, got a contract for a book called The Tipping Point, which did very well. And that book led to another book and another book and another book. And I am standing here today because of that moment in the library 25 years ago. So The Tipping Point, my first book, was about all kinds of things. I talked
Tipping point.
这个知识点的含义是指某个事件或行动的临界点，超过这个点后会引发一系列连锁反应。惯用法在口语中 tipping point 经常用于描述一个人的行为或决定是否会导致重大变化。
about hush puppies and Paul Revere and teenage smoking, but at the heart of it was a chapter on why did crime decline in New York. And in that chapter, I talked a lot about a theory called broken windows theory, which was a very famous idea that had been pioneered by two criminologists called George Kelling and James Q. Wilson in the 1980s. Very influential article in which they
Influential.
这个词组的含义是有影响力的，通常用于描述一个人或一件事物对他人或社会的影响。
They said that they argued that very small things in the environment can be triggers for larger crimes. That essentially small instances of disorder are tipping points for very serious things like
Tipping points.
这个词组的含义是指某些小事或事件可能会触发更大的问题或变化。
murder or rape or any kind of violent crime. It was an epidemic theory of crime. And
Epidemic theory of crime.
这个短语的含义是指犯罪可能会像流行病一样传播和蔓延。
the New York City Police Department took that idea very seriously. And one of the things they began to do in the 1990s during this crime drop was to say, what this argument means is that we can't be passive anymore. We have to be proactive. We have to go out there, and if someone is
Go out there.
这个词组的含义是去外面做事，或者去挑战别人。比如 We have to go out there and stop them. 这句话中的 go out there 表示要去外面做出行动。
jaywalking or jumping a turnstile or doing graffiti or peeing on the sidewalk, we've got to stop them. And if we see
Stop them.
这个短语的含义是阻止或制止某人做某事。比如 We've got to stop them. 这句话中的 stop them 表示要阻止他们违反规则。
a young man walking down the street and he looks a little bit suspicious, we got to stop him and frisk him for his weapons, right? That's what
Frisk him.
这个动词的含义是快速检查某人是否携带违法物品。比如 We've got to stop him and frisk him for his weapons. 这句话中的 frisk him 表示要快速检查他是否携带武器。
and how the NYPD interpreted the broken windows theory in New York. And my
Broken windows theory.
这个知识点的含义是指一个社区或社会中小规模的犯罪行为，如破窗、盗窃等，如果不及时处理，可能会导致更严重的犯罪行为。这种理论最初由美国犯罪学家 James Q. Wilson 提出。
chapter was how millions of people around the world came to understand the crime drop in New York, that it was all broken windows, right? And here's the thing that I have come to understand about that explanation I gave of why crime fell in New York. I was wrong. I didn't understand this until quite recently when I went back and I decided on the 25th anniversary of my first book, The Tipping Point, that I would write a sequel. It's called Revenge of the Tipping Point. And I went back.
Revenge of the Tipping Point.
这个知识点的含义是指对之前的成就或作品进行回应或复仇。惯用法是在口语中使用 revenge 或 sequel 来描述新的作品或项目。
And for the first time in a quarter century, I reread my original book. I'm not someone who likes to revisit things, but I did it, and it was a uniquely complicated experience. It was like looking back at your high school yearbook, you know, when you see yourself and you have some combination of, wow, I look young, and also, wow, I really wore that. It was like that. And what I realized is that in the intervening years, since I wrote that explanation of why I think crime fell in New York, the theory of broken windows had been tested. There was a kind of classic natural experiment to see whether that theory worked. And the natural experiment was a court case, maybe one of the most famous court cases in New York history, called Floyd v. City of New York. It involved a young man named David Floyd who had been stopped a number of occasions by the NYPD and was the face of a class action lawsuit that said,
Face of a class action lawsuit.
这个知识点的含义是指某个案例或事件的代表人物或象征。
The practice of stopping young men, largely young men of color, just because they look a little suspicious to police is not constitutional. You can't do that, right? And to everyone's surprise, the Floyd lawsuit goes before a federal judge, and the federal judge rules in David Floyd's favor. And overnight, the broken windows era in New York City policing ends. And the NYPD goes from, in 2011, they stopped and frisked 700,000 young men, right? And after the Floyd lawsuit was decided in 2013, that number drops to less than 50,000, right? So this is the perfect natural experiment. You have New York before Floyd and New York after Floyd. You have, before Floyd, you have the principal tactic of the NYPD is stopping everyone they can. And after Floyd, you have, that goes away. They can't do that anymore, right? This is the perfect test case for whether you think that's why crime fell in New York. And if you believe in the power of broken windows policing, then your expectation has to be that after the Floyd case, when broken windows goes away, crime's going to go back up, right? And I should tell you that in 2013, in the wake of the Floyd case, everybody thought crime was going to go back up, right? The NYPD thought that, the city government thought that, the pundits thought that. Even the judge who wrote the opinion saying that stop and frisk was unconstitutional said in her opinion that she strongly suspected that as a result of this opinion, crime would go back up. I thought
Go back up.
这个知识点的含义是指犯罪率会增加。惯用法是在口语中使用 go back up 来表示犯罪率的上升。
crime was going to go back up, right? All of us had internalized the logic of broken windows. We said, yes, we know this strategy poses an incredible burden on young men, but what choice do we have, right? You know, if the choice is being stopped repeatedly by police or being killed, maybe we're better off with the former than the latter. This is the price we pay for a safe New York, right? So what happens after the Floyd case? Stop and frisk goes away, and crime.
Stop and frisk.
Stop and frisk 是一种美国警察的执法方式，涉及到对个人的随机检查和搜查。这种做法在2013年被纽约市法院判定违宪。
False. In fact, crime in New York City undergoes a second, even more miraculous decline, right? And what's interesting about this is, you know, when the first crime declined in the 1990s, you see that decline almost everywhere in the United States. Not quite as steep as New York, but crime goes down everywhere. And then in every other city in the United States, crime plateaus. But New York gets rid of broken windows and crime
Plateaus.
这个词组的含义是指某个过程或状态在一段时间内保持稳定，不再上升或下降。例如Crime plateaus in every other city in the United States.
Crime starts to fall and fall and fall all over again, to the point by 2019 that New York City is as safe as Paris, which is not a sentence I ever thought anyone would ever say in my lifetime, right? And what we realized in that second crime decline is that it wasn't broken windows. It's not indiscriminate policing that causes crime to fall. Rather, it is the intelligent and thoughtful and selective application of police authority that causes crime to fall. Now, there's a couple of really puzzling things here. One is that people don't seem to have internalized the fact that New York underwent this second, even more dramatic crime fall. People still act like it's the year 2000 when it comes to making sense of New York. You know, a whole bunch of very, very wealthy hedge fund guys have very loudly left New York for Miami in recent years. And they all say when they're packing up their offices in New York, we can't take the crime anymore. Well, violent crime in Miami is twice as high as New York City. If they were really concerned about violent crime, they would leave Coral Gables before they get murdered and move to the Bronx, where it is a whole lot safer. The other even more important thing, though, is that people act like stop and frisk actually worked. No one seems to have internalized the lesson of the great Floyd case natural experiment. If you listen to people on the, I'm not going to name their names, but people going around the country now campaigning for higher office, they will say things like, it's time to bring back stop and frisk and broken windows policing. It works.
Stop and frisk.
Stop and frisk 是一种美国警察的执法方式，涉及到对公众进行随机检查和搜查。这种做法在2013年引起了广泛争议。
So well in New York, they're acting as if we didn't have that great moment of understanding in 2013. And for that misunderstanding, I think I bear some of the blame. I was the one who wrote this book saying this was the greatest tactic ever in stopping crime. Now, how do I make sense of my mistake?
Make sense of my mistake.
这个知识点的含义是指尝试理解或解释自己的错误或失误。惯用法是使用这个短语来表达对自己行为的反思和自我批评。
Well, I can give you all kinds of excuses. You know, I can say, I'm not a fortune teller. I didn't know that David Floyd was going to come along 10 years after I wrote my book and give us this great test case in broken windows policing. You know, I could say that, you know, I was just writing what everybody believed back in 1996 and 1997. But I don't think those excuses hold any water whatsoever. I think that journalists, writers, need to be held to a higher standard, right? I told a story about how crime fell in New York, and I told the story like the story was over and like I knew what the answer to the story was. And it wasn't over, and I didn't know the answer, right? I wrote, I know this is what happened, and what I should have said is, this is what I believe happened now, right?
I believe happened now.
这个短语是指当前的时间点或情况。它强调了我们必须考虑到现在的位置和可能随着事实变化而改变的事实。
And those words, I believe happened now, have to be at the center of any understanding of how the world works. We have to acknowledge that we are representing the position of this very moment and that position could change if the facts change. Right? The great desire of any writer is to write a book for the ages that will forever explain the way things are, but that's not possible, and no one should ever try. That was my mistake, and I'm sorry.
And I'm sorry.
这个短语表示道歉或后悔。这句话中 Malcolm 表示对自己的错误或疏忽感到抱歉。
That was some mea culpa, Malcolm.
Mea culpa.
这是一个拉丁语词组，意思是我的过失或我的错误。它常用于表示对自己的错误或疏忽的道歉。
And so I have a couple of questions for you. If you don't mind, I want to take you back 25 years to that version of yourself. And so you talked about how there was a sense of anxiety and fear about what crime was happening around that time. I grew up in New York around that time, 25 years ago, being in my early 20s, and having these experiences with my friends where they experienced unfortunate instances with stop and frisk. So much
Stop and frisk.
Stop and frisk 是一种美国警察的执法方式，涉及到对公众进行随机检查和搜查。这种做法在许多城市中引起了争议。
So they had anxiety, hurt, and fear.
Yeah.
And so when you were thinking about this and the support, did you ever think about what if they got it wrong? What if it was wrong? And innocent people were going to have to experience this. What were your thoughts about that back then?
Well, I wasn't thinking about that. I mean, it's funny, when I was sort of trying to figure out what I did wrong in that chapter, I went down to Philadelphia and I went and met with a group of doctors, all of them black, at University of Pennsylvania. Because they had done some really interesting work on crime and I wanted to get their sense. And one of the doctors had read that chapter on crime and she said, when I read your chapter on crime, you were exceedingly interested. I opened that chapter with the famous story of Bernie Goetz, the guy who shot the kids on the subway. And she said, go back and reread the way you wrote that story, and you'll realize you spend a lot of time talking about the fear of the white guy, and you have 2 sentences on the kids. And the kids were every bit as much as damaged as the guy who shot them. And I realized I think I was just like so many of us, I was in a little bubble, and I was seeing
In a little bubble.
这个知识点的含义是指一个人在自己的世界里忽略了外界的存在和影响。这种情况下，人会变得自私、狭隘，缺乏对他人的理解和同情。
the problem from one perspective, and like many, middle and upper class professionals in Manhattan, I wasn't thinking about the world through the eyes of someone in the Bronx or Brooklyn. And
See the world through someone else's eyes.
这个知识点的含义是指从别人的角度看待问题或世界。这是一个常见的口语俚语，特别是在美国人之间使用。
some of that have to do with youth, and some of that has to do with foolishness. And I'd like to think I'm a little wiser now.
Right. So you had a quote, yes. You had a quote. I told the story like I knew the answer, and it wasn't over. How has that insight affected your thinking and your writing now?
I've tried to be, I realize when I look back at my younger self, I was way too certain about the ideas that I was putting forth. And I thought that if you wanted to win over an audience, you had to communicate certainty. And now I realize that's actually backwards. That what you're more capable of winning over an audience when you admit to the uncertainty and the fragility of your position. People want that. They like that. They appreciate that spirit far more. And people are much more likely, I think, to be suspicious of someone who seems falsely certain.
Well,
And people are much more likely, I think, to be suspicious of someone who seems falsely certain.
这个句子使用了一个复杂的句子结构 and 加 subject 加 verb， 表示人们更容易怀疑某个人，如果他们表现出过度自信。恳请点赞，订阅我们的频道，一起学习演讲中的实用英语。